This video is brought to you by The Walking Dead Survivors, available now on Android and iOS mobile devices. Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take an early look at the upcoming cooperative zombie shooter game Back 4 Blood, and see how it compares both visually and from a gameplay perspective to the hugely popular Left 4 Dead series. Now, before we get started, it's important to keep in mind that the footage I'm going to use today of Back 4 Blood was recorded during my time playing through the game in its first closed alpha test, way back in December. Because of this, a lot of the content and features that we cover today, especially in regards to visual design, may change by the game's planned October release. So, while I'll still go over the visuals a little bit, I want to focus this video primarily on the gameplay features, including how the weapons function, the AI director, the level designs, and any unique gameplay mechanics. Now, for those of you not familiar with these games, Back 4 Blood is a cooperative zombie shooter game created by Turtle Rock Studios, the original creators of the Left 4 Dead series. After that first Left 4 Dead, Valve's internal studios created Left 4 Dead 2 a year later, introducing a few new features like weapons, items, characters, environments, and enemies. But it's still all heavily based around the design that Turtle Rock came up with. So throughout this video, I'll be using both Left 4 Dead games interchangeably to give a more broad analysis of how Back 4 Blood stacks up. And I also want to point out some things that I'd like Back 4 Blood to accomplish by the time it's released. For reference, both games are being played on the PC, with their settings pushed as high as possible at a native 4K resolution. But again, bear in mind that Back 4 Blood could change a great deal by release, so take the visual comparisons with a grain of salt. And before we get started, I want to thank the new Walking Dead Survivors mobile game for sponsoring this video. Walking Dead Survivors is a real-time tower defense game based on the popular graphic novels by Robert Kirkman. In it, players need to establish and maintain a community of survivors, manage their resources, and explore the unknown, all while defending their camp against waves of walker hordes using various traps, evacuation routes, and fortified structures. They've even included over 80 different fan-favorite characters like Rick Grimes, Glenn, and Negan. Additionally, players can team up with their friends and clans to help fight off the undead together. Be sure to try the game out for free using the links that I provided in the description. Alright, so let's kick this comparison off by first briefly going over the presentation. Now again, I don't want to spend too much time with this particular video on visuals, simply because Back 4 Blood isn't really completed yet. But even so, it's shaping up to be a big improvement graphically over the old Left 4 Dead games. And this makes sense considering Left 4 Dead released almost 13 years ago. I think it's also important to note that while Left 4 Dead was built on Valve's Source engine, Back 4 Blood will instead be running on the Unreal 4 engine, meaning we're going to observe a lot of nice new visual enhancements with this new game, like true volumetric lighting, increased particle density, and just more impressive shader implementation overall. The character models in particular sport far more detail in Back 4 Blood, with eyes that seem to reflect light more believably, along with higher res textures and increased poly counts that were obviously not possible back in the day. That being said, I had to give props to the team that made Left 4 Dead 1 and 2 for creating some truly age-defying character models. All of these iconic characters still hold up remarkably well, with some great animation work coupled with a lot of intricate details. However, the infected characters, mainly the common infected, don't hold up quite as well. Because this is a first-person shooter, a lot of attention has similarly been applied to the weapon models, that look significantly better than the old first-person weapon models in Left 4 Dead. Not only are the textures and poly counts superior in Back 4 Blood, but there's also a lot of really cool details that the developers threw in to make the action more visceral. My favorite being the way spent bullet casings pour out of this AK when the player crouches and angles the weapon. Moving on, I want to talk about the environments. Now with the alpha, there was only a single campaign to play through, that takes players through 4 linear levels that will dynamically change based on the group's performance each time. This is an identical format to how Left 4 Dead's levels are handled, though there are a few subtle differences that are worth pointing out. Just like with the characters and weapon models, Back 4 Blood's environments look fantastic. There's a lot of depth and complexity in each scene that makes it feel more modern than the often drab and empty worlds of Left 4 Dead. Vegetation in particular is more lush and realistic looking, and the textures applied to every surface look much better. However, there's still something off about Back 4 Blood's level designs. I think the one problem I have with Back 4 Blood right now, that hopefully will change by release, is that the levels feel too small when compared to the old Left 4 Dead games. I think the reason Left 4 Dead games work so well even today is that their levels are just wide enough that players can still get a little bit lost in them if they're not paying close enough attention. Take this old abandoned train yard in the Death Toll campaign, for example. This area appears to be very large, with lots of space around this big central tower. For veteran players, it's obvious that you need to travel straight through the train cars to the staircase on the far side of the compound. But for newcomers, their first thought may be to climb that big tower, which will then give them a better idea of the level layout and where they should go next. This explorative nature is at the core of what makes Left 4 Dead's levels so much more fun to venture through, and I think this is something Back 4 Blood has a real problem with right now. The paths in these 4 levels are tiny, with no room to venture off at all, and the overall length of these sections of the campaign feel tiny in comparison to similar areas in Left 4 Dead. Another aspect that I think is critical to deliver a memorable experience in this type of game is the way environmental storytelling is handled. Left 4 Dead delivered players a surprisingly deep narrative without ever resorting to any scripted cinematics or cutscenes. This is because each area in the game has some sort of story to tell, whether it's graffiti written on the walls of safe houses, or just the configuration of props in the environment, like a crashed vehicle and a lifeless body nearby. In Back 4 Blood, this storytelling design seems to have taken a backseat to the gameplay. There's so much non-stop action that you don't ever get a chance to breathe, and when you do, there's not really that much to see due to the claustrophobic design of the main path. There are certainly hints of environmental storytelling, including some very well-hidden tape recorders that will play back audio recordings like in System Shock. But I'd like to see larger areas to explore and more clever placement to help the environment tell a story all on its own. Wrapping up the visual portion of this comparison are the lighting and various other effects that, unsurprisingly, are greatly improved in Back 4 Blood. The volumetric lighting in particular helps to give the dark outdoor environments a great new moody feel, with thick fog reflecting soft blue light that contrasts perfectly with bright environmental fires and the creepy glowing eyes of the Ridden. I especially love the more advanced specular lighting on display, especially when looking at the vegetation and how it reflects nearby ambient light from things like flares. It's a really pretty looking game most of the time, though I did find some instances where things like fire effects just don't behave properly, which I assume is just a symptom of the game in its early development stages that should look better by the final release. So with that being said, let's turn our attention over to the gameplay, starting with the player movement and controls. In both Left 4 Dead 1 and 2, players are limited to only a few simple actions. They can run, jump, walk, crouch, and fire their weapon, along with the ability to bash enemies away if they get too close. But unlike most shooter games today, players are not able to aim down a weapon's iron sights. Guns like the M16 can only be fired from the hip, and there's no way to zoom the camera in, making weapon aim a little bit more challenging. Back 4 Blood, on the other hand, is built with more modern amenities. Players can still run, jump, walk, and crouch, but they can also sprint now, vault over low walls, and aim down the sights of any weapon they have equipped, with hit markers also being made standard to communicate to the player more clearly whether a target has been killed. It feels much more polished and certainly makes the combat more visceral, but there's also a lot of work that needs to be done on the hitboxes, especially the hard-hitting bruiser that I'll talk about more in a bit. The game's combat just feels a bit messy in its current state, with inconsistent shoves that can cause players to lose their health unfairly, whereas Left 4 Dead feels so incredibly polished at this point that a really good player can manage to pass through the game even on its hardest difficulty without taking any damage, as long as they're careful and aware of when to use certain actions in close quarter combat. Speaking of which, let's talk about the types of weapons available in both games. In the original Left 4 Dead, players are limited to only a few different firearms, separated by tiers. There's your Tier 1 weapons like the Uzi and pump shotgun that are reliable but not the greatest, and then there's the Tier 2 weapons like the M16, the tac shotgun, and the hunting rifle that are much more powerful and, when played to their strengths, highly effective. On top of this, players are also given a sidearm with unlimited ammunition and an upgrade to run akimbo with them, and also a couple throwable weapons like the Molotov and the pipe bomb, which can be hugely powerful tools. In Left 4 Dead 2, the weapon list is improved further, with new Tier 1 and Tier 2 weapons like the silenced SMG, the chrome shotgun, and the AK-47, all of which are balanced even more precisely. Left 4 Dead 2 also introduces new melee weapons into the mix that can be used instead of a sidearm, and even these are balanced carefully, with some weapons having a wider reach while others can sever limbs more easily. Regardless, all of the weapons in both Left 4 Dead games must be found and swapped in the environment itself. In fact, sometimes players can go the entire campaign without ever finding their favorite weapon due to the game's AI director. But in Back 4 Blood, this isn't handled quite the same. there's a lot more weapons to choose from here, including AKs, burstfire M16s, and melee weapons. But more importantly, players are no longer forced to find ammunition in the environment, but can instead purchase more ammo from vendors in the safe rooms. Players can also use this vendor to refill their health, buy throwables like grenades, and can even purchase upgrades for their weapons like laser sights, scopes, and barrels, making copper pickups almost more important to find than standard supplies. This is a major change up to how the formula works, as players are no longer dependent on the map itself, but can instead fine-tune their experience more efficiently the longer that they play. Though I do feel that the system takes away a bit from the feeling of the experience, it can potentially be detrimental to the survivalist feel of the Left 4 Dead games. Though at least it does get players straight into the action, rather than forcing them to use weak weapons for the first half of the campaign like before. Moving on, let's talk about the enemies you'll be shooting in either game. In both games, the environments are littered with weak but numerous zombie-like enemies called common infected. These enemies by default lumber around mindlessly, vomiting and hitting each other, but once triggered, they'll sprint to the nearest player, or whoever the AI director designates as a worthwhile target. But these aren't really much of a threat in either game. They're more of a distracting nuisance, allowing the special infected to do their thing. In Left 4 Dead, there's 3 main special infected characters that constantly spawn to ruin a team's day. There's the Boomer, that can spawn a horde of enemies if he vomits or explodes on a survivor. The Hunter, that is agile and can leap across rooftops, and then pounce on the survivor to deal a lot of damage quickly. The Smoker, that can use his long tongue to pull survivors into danger. And then there's 2 special bosses, the Witch, that will instantly down or kill a player if they annoy her enough, and the powerful Tank, that absorbs a ton of damage, can throw players around, and even rip huge rocks out of the ground and throw them. In Left 4 Dead 2, this roster was enhanced further, with the Jockey, the Charger, and the Spitter, adding some nice variety to the action. That's a lot of different enemies to contend with, but only so many of these characters can ever spawn at one time, and each character has a very specific musical cue that plays to warn the survivor team of what to expect. Back 4 Blood follows a similar design for its special infected. First, there's the Hawker, that acts a lot like the Hunters, in that they're nimble and can jump around and stick to walls, but they can also pin players down using a ranged spitting attack, removing the need to pounce directly onto a survivor. Next, there's the Wretch, that is basically a Boomer, only with a lot more health, and on top of calling in a horde on a player, its acidic vomit can also damage the player too. The Bruisers are sort of like Left 4 Dead 2's Chargers, with one freakishly large arm that can dish out some serious damage. Only they aren't nearly as fast as the Charger, and make up for their lack of speed with a ton of health, almost making them as formidable as Left 4 Dead's tanks. Then there's the Snitch, that sort of acts like a witch in regards to its proximity-triggered attack, only it instead calls in a horde when alerted. Finally, there's the Ogre. Now this is the one enemy that I'm really disappointed with so far. Unlike the Tank, that can appear almost anywhere along the main path to attack the survivor team, the Ogre is much more limited due to its size. There seems to be only very specific set locations where these encounters can occur, and let's say you get killed by him in one of these areas, well, he'll continue to spawn in this exact same area until you restart the whole campaign. It feels like a really big step backwards from Left 4 Dead. Sure, the Ogre looks cool and it's gigantic, but once players learn that all they have to do is juke him out and get past a certain door, then all that tension is completely gone, making what should be a horrifying encounter just feel like a minor nuisance. There's a few other enemy types as well, like the uncommon infected featured in Left 4 Dead 2, that kind of make a return in Back 4 Blood. But for now, let's move on to Back 4 Blood's biggest change, the card system. Now, the card system is something you'll either love or you'll absolutely hate depending on how you feel about these types of mechanics in games. The card system introduces new modifiers to the experience, kind of like Left 4 Dead 2's optional mutations playlist. Only there's several different modifiers that can be applied at once, and they're mandatory for every campaign. Players can create card decks on the main menu that are then automatically chosen by the AI director at the start of each chapter, determining how the experience will play out. Cards include player buffs like faster reload speed, increased capacity, or resistance against a certain enemy type, but also include corruption effects that can hinder a group's progress through the level by making it harder to see or increasing the spawn rate of a certain enemy. It makes the overall gameplay experience feel more like a board game, which can certainly be fun, but I can understand why some die-hard fans of Left 4 Dead may be disappointed. as Left 4 Dead's difficulty felt more dynamic and unpredictable, and therefore more immersive. And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, Back 4 Blood is probably the closest I've seen a game get to recapturing the fantastic cooperative feel of the original Left 4 Dead games. However, there are definitely points of concern, most notably the smaller level sizes, the limitations of enemies like the Ogre, and the over-reliance on its new card system. But considering we're still several months out from the full release, pretty much any of this can change still. And I'll be sure to provide an updated comparison when I finally get my hands on the finalized version of the game later this year. But what do you guys think? Are you impressed with Back 4 Blood in its current state? Or do you wish some things were different? Let me know in the comments section. Also, don't forget to check out the new Walking Dead Survivor game, available free using the link I provided in the description. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this posted every week.